quickly, I'll just say the militia is an old term. In effect, it's a citizen soldier. They were called irregular troops as opposed to the regular army that you know, which are regular troops. In other words, a citizen soldier was the man who would come out when he was needed. The militia companies were inherited from, or the system was inherited from England. Back in the colonial days, the English, who of course controlled the colonies, wouldn't allow a standing army as we know it today. But they did allow militia companies because they had this system in England for many years before that. The way it worked was that a group of citizens from a locality, in this case Pawtuxet, got together and they petitioned the General Assembly for a charter to form what was in effect a little small private army, with the intention that that army would, or I shouldn't use the term army because they were very small, they were usually 20 to 40 people, but that group would be intended to protect that locality, again in this case Pawtuxet, which was a very wealthy little seaport, against any enemy operations, starting as early as the 1600s, when they were concerned about the Dutch and the French. In fact, if you were to check the history, you'd find that Roger Williams was the first commanding officer of the Rhode Island militia. He was called, and they're called today, the governor today is called the Captain General of the state troops. As time went by, militia companies became the way that the colonies planned to defend themselves. As they saw the war with England progressing, or rather the likelihood of war progressing, and they started to accumulate arms and weaponry and so forth to defend themselves in case of the military action that they knew was coming, they had no choice but to depend upon the militia. And the militia was an independent group. Each group was independent. For example, in East Greenwich we have the Kentish Guards. They had a charter which was different than our charter. They could operate as they chose to operate in East Greenwich, and we could operate as we chose to operate in Pawtuxet. And that was, of course, one of the difficulties that, from a military standpoint, the commanding people, and once the war progressed, ran into. Another difficulty that took place, although it was a characteristic of the militia, was that the officers were elected. And an elected officer, of course, might have been just the most popular officer. He might not necessarily have been the best officer. And the election would take place every year. So the continuity in the leadership sometimes could have been a difficulty. But as time went by, and the war got very close, Rhode Island, like the other colonies, established a number of militia companies. I'm not sure just how many we had by the time that the Revolution broke out. But if we have 10 now, I'd say we probably had over 50 then. Many of those went out of existence as time went by. The militia became, after the war, I'll go back to what they did during the war in a moment, but the militia became a very significant part of the social structure of the community as the years went by and up until the Civil War. In the 1830s, 1820s, 1840s, in that area, anybody that wanted to be anybody should have been in the militia. It was a social thing to do. They became very, very important. And it was also interesting to see some of the things they did during peacetime because, of course, they had these very gala military balls that were just colorful uniforms all over, and ladies in very beautiful dresses, and toasts in the course of a military ball sometimes went as high as 40 toasts, and more than 40 toasts. And if you can imagine what that might have done to the evening, by the time they were finished, it should have been even more. The militia stayed as a very important part of the American scene right up until the Civil War. And when the Civil War got underway, and of course the Civil War was the first real modern war with modern weaponry and large-scale armies, the militia became integrated in many cases into the armed forces. And following the Civil War, the National Guard emerged out of the militia system. So when you talk about militiamen, you're talking about people who were in all the wars and today are in the National Guard. The National Guard is militia because they are citizen soldiers as opposed to the full-time regular troops that you see in the American Army. Incidentally, if you'd like to ask or challenge or what have you along the way, you just speak up and I'll be happy to try to field that. Now, what did the militia do? At the start of the war, it was the militia that fought the Battle of Lexington and Concord. There was no one else to fight it. And that was probably the highlight of what the militia really accomplished in terms of very positive, colorful response, because that battle was a remarkable battle, and most people are not really aware of just what it was. But by the time the British got back to Boston, after going to Concord, Lexington, Concord, and then being harassed all the way back, anywhere between 1,700 and 4,000 militiamen had been firing at them. Now, most people think of a little pitched battle on Lexington Green, another little pitched battle at Concord Bridge. That's not the way it was. They left, as I recall, about 4 o'clock in the morning. The British did. They marched 18 miles. They fought a very small skirmish in Lexington. They fought a small pitched battle in Concord, and they destroyed some military stores, which was the purpose of their marching out there in the first place. They burned some of the town, not much, but they burned some of it, and then they retreated back to Boston. That's 18 more miles back to Boston. But by that time, with Paul Revere and the other people that had been going around raising the countryside, the militia companies from all over the Massachusetts area, central Massachusetts area, had accumulated, and they harassed them all the way back. And it's kind of an interesting thing, the way it happened, because they probably wouldn't have harassed them at all if the British didn't do one thing wrong. As they were marching out of Concord, in the normal formation of their march along a narrow road, the rear rank of grenadiers turned and fired at the accumulated minutemen. And had they not done that, it's possible that there'd been no problem. They'd have gotten back to Boston. They probably might even not have had a continuing war, but they did fire them. And that just unleashed a hornet's nest, because there were always accumulated minutemen. Now, so the militia was significant, very significant at the beginning. As the war progressed, in fact, right after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, you may recall in the history that the Americans penned the British in at Boston. They ringed Boston with troops, and those troops were, of course, militia. And they were one of the categories. State troops were raised just as the independent militia companies were raised. So the states, the colonies at the time, now states, sent troops up there for an army of observation. Rhode Island sent them too. In fact, that's where Nathaniel Greene got his real recognition. But the interesting thing about that is that all those soldiers that the state sent enlisted in that army, called an army of observation, in the name of the king and for the rights of Rhode Island. Not in any way were they renouncing the king at that point. They were enlisting in the name of the king. So the trend, as you know, drifted away from the business of simply rights as Englishmen into freedom and independence. But the militia now continued in operation. The Independent Charter Command, that's what these militia companies such as the Pawtuxet Rangers were called, continued to operate with their charter. And they did provide one other enormously valuable service. If you talk to many of the militia companies today, they sometimes have the feeling that the militia won the war. It didn't win the war, but it did do this. If you remember, Washington ran into great difficulty with his army melting away at times of enlistment and so forth, and the privation that the American regular forces suffered were very severe. So sometimes the army got down, I think at Valley Forge, it got down as low as 5,000 men. But every place the army went, the militia was there. So if they went to one town or one city or one locality or one region, he could count on the militia to spring up. They were not necessarily the best trained troops. Sometimes they were very well trained, sometimes they weren't. If they came from a sophisticated area, a wealthy area, they would probably be outfitted very well. If they came from the back farmlands, sometimes where money was scarce, they wouldn't be outfitted very well. And it was a difficult task for them to do it. But every place they went, the militia was available to Washington as a supplement to his army. And probably the best illustration of that is the Battle of Saratoga, where General Burgoyne, coming down from Canada with the intention of splitting the New England states off, or colonies off from the rest of the colony, ran into an accumulation of Americans, I think totaling as many as 17,000 at one time, most of whom were militia companies drawn from all parts of New England. And that was an enormously valuable contribution. But it was a good illustration, because we vote on all the activities that we're going to take part in. And the thing goes on a semi-democratic basis, although when we're out on the, when we're out in a parade or an event, the democracy, of course, is sidetracked for a moment, because that is what a military organization is, and we are, in fact, a military organization. Now, what else can I tell you that might be interesting? Sure?
The militia, the Pawtuxet Rangers, used to be on Fort Avenue. What part of Fort Avenue were you on?
If you go to there's a plaque on Fort Avenue, which identifies the position of what the fort, or where the fort was. It is right at is it Sheldon Street that runs into Fort Avenue?
Yep.
It's right at the intersection of Fort Avenue and Sheldon Street. And during the Revolution, the Rangers occupied a fort that was built with the intention of protecting Providence against the intrusion from the British fleet. They expected the British to come up the bay, land on, try to land on that location, and so they built a fort. And throughout the course of the war, the Rangers did operate that fort. Now, additional to that, they did fight at the Battle of Saratoga. They responded like many of the New England militia companies to the call for troops to combat Burgoyne as he came down from Canada. They fought in the Battle of Rhode Island, a battle that many people don't even know about. But following the loss of the British Army or Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, the Americans felt, well, now this is a good opportunity to push the British out of Newport, because they had a relatively small garrison there. And in order to accomplish that, they accumulated some Continental troops, Washington's army, as well as a number of militia companies, including the Pawtuxet Rangers, and they went down the island and did, in fact, engage the British. And it was the first effort of a combined